You may have come across the story that China's developing its own alternative to GPS. That might be ringing your conspiracy bells and scaring you a little bit. I want to demystify all this sort of thing.
Right. Because why would it be scary? You know what I mean?
Why would it be scary?
Yeah. Like, why would people instantly be like, oh, crap, China, and, all their things?
People are rationally and irrationally afraid of China.
For sure.
For valid and invalid reasons.
For sure.
Can't let them dirty Reds get
one over on America.
Exactly.
When you talk about GPS, obviously, you're talking about global positioning satellites.
Positioning system, yes.
Right, our system, right. Now, why would China be making its own that?
Well, I think in order to answer that question, we have to go back. We have to go back and do a little bit of history. After the launch of Sputnik, as if you remember from our moon landing episode, was the
first ever satellite.
Right, developed by the Soviets. There were two American physicists. They realized they could utilize the Doppler effect to pinpoint Sputnik's location.
Ah, the Doppler effect.
Yes.
I remember learning that in high school.
You do you?
Yeah, actually, about sound.
Win one for public education.
You're on notch 1.
So the U.S. government started to get interested in investigating the inverse idea of using satellites to track something on Earth, especially when the Air Force and the Navy got involved, because they could realize, wait a minute, that could be super helpful for our missile programs, because remember, this is Cold War era.
Yes. Accurate munitions is probably a strategic advantage for any military.
Most definitely. And that's kind of what rationalized the giant amount of money that got poured into this. So a bunch of other projects were going on. To make a long story short, they all coalesced into the development of what we now know as GPS.
Mm-hmm. Was DARPA involved, Marcus?
DARPA was involved,
of course.
Actually. Yeah. Another big event, skipping ahead in the timeline, in 1983, Korean Airlines Flight 007. It was flying from New York to Seoul, South Korea, and it had a stopover in Alaska. But they mistakenly flew over restricted Soviet airspace. And the Soviets were like, oh, it's an American spy plane, shoot it. Bunch of civilians died.
Really?
Yep. Pretty terrible event. And actually, I guess it wasn't admitted till the 90s. So this prompted Reagan to make GPS freely available worldwide, to not let something like this happen again, because they had navigational errors. So they, like I said, they were accidentally flying over like restricted Soviet airspace because they were from New York through Alaska to South Korea.
That's the main plot of that documentary that I was doing research on that I was just telling you about.
So
when you mean that he allowed it, what do you mean? Like he just allowed telecom companies access to the military satellites that were providing this GPS? Basically,
more or less.
Okay.
Because
that makes sense.
It was a secret tech, basically, that they were using.
And now they're like, okay,
wait, we can solve this and not let our citizens and everybody.
Right. Let's not keep it secret tech. Let's make it just
because we can use
the baseline of tech.
Because GPS, let's do a brief summary of how the tech works. So it requires line of sight to at least 4 satellites to work. So they kind of just triangulate your position. Because if you just have maybe 1 or 2, like there could be like a bunch of errors because all kinds of complicated stuff about timing in the atmosphere.
Yeah, a ton of variables,
how
I'm sure.
Everything scatters, and the weakness of the signal, because it's not a very strong signal, as you might imagine something that's developed in the mid-20th century would be.
Right. And so people basically use like the phones and the towers and the satellites in conjunction to be able to bounce the signal around the Earth to be able to have line of sight, like you were talking about, a straight shot of the signal.
And most people are familiar with GPS when they're like, oh, I don't know how to get to Chili's or whatever. So they put it in their phone. GPS gives you not only location, but also time and speed. The thing is, like I said, it's developed by the U.S. government, and the government actually has the ability to deny access or degrade the signal at will.
For whatever reason? Whether it's national security or...
They actually have done that before.
Like officially?
Yeah. If an enemy is like using it to get around, they could just be like, oh, well, let's turn that off and disrupt their communication.
So if they're getting like a signal from a region that they're not like politically friendly with or whatever, they may be like, just turn that shit off. And let's not let those people use this service.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay.
Or if you just want to be a meanie.
Yeah, of course. I mean, all the range of the spectrum of why you would want to do that, for sure.
Yeah, so...
Okay, that makes sense, though. And one would argue, like, well, this is our satellite, so, put your own satellite up there. And I mean, right, though? Like, I mean, kind of like a private company kind of a thing, right?
And we're getting into sort of the motivations behind it, but I need to explain a couple more things first. There was a bill that was actually an executive order signed by Bill Clinton. The U.S. government has the ability to make the signal shittier, basically, through a process they call selective availability.
Right.
And it has to do with, like, the difference in time between the clocks on the ground and the clocks in the satellites. And there's a bunch of environmental factors and whatnot, obviously. Basically, what you need to know is they have the ability to turn it off or make it crappy.
Right.
And so that actually stopped under Clinton. And
because he signed some bill that said everybody gets access.
Because other countries were developing alternatives and stuff like that.
So he tried to head him off at the pass kind of thing?
Yeah, there was actually the EU is building a system called Galileo at the time, from my understanding.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Which will be their own satellite network?
Yeah, so the European Union has Galileo, India has NavIC, Japan has QZSS, which is actually really interesting. It actually augments GPS, so it's like a secondary thing to make it better. And it's actually expected to be independent like the other ones by 2023.
Huh.
But the big news is, right now, China has this one called BeiDou, BeiDubs.
BDubs.
So China has BDubs, and recently they've finished their third version of it, so it's kind of actually now somewhat
viable.
Has parity to GPS, I guess you could say. Russia has one called GLONASS, which was actually developed around the same time as GPS. Of course, there was a navigation gap. That one wasn't actually fully global until the 2000s.
Okay.
With that, there was also a question of how much better the military version of GPS is versus the civilian version. And actually, straight from the website gps.gov, it says, is military GPS more accurate than civilian GPS? The user range error of the GPS signals in space is actually the same for the civilian and military GPS services. However, most of today's civilian devices use only one GPS frequency, while military receivers use two. Using two GPS frequencies improves accuracy by correcting signal distortions caused by the Earth's atmosphere. Dual frequency GPS equipment is commercially available for civilian use, but its cost and size has limited it to professional applications. With augmentation systems, civilian users can actually receive better GPS accuracy than the military.
So when it says two frequencies, does that mean it's getting data from two satellites?
I don't know necessarily if it is AM and FM, right? It's the same sort of thing, basically. I'm oversimplifying it, but it's the same thing. But imagine our GPSs only get AM, right? Theirs can do AM and FM, so they can kind of get more variety of programs.
Yeah. More of the information spectrum is revealed.
Yeah, and actually on that topic, that's a good segue. If you're interested in any sort of spectrum type of stuff or the technology, the stuff with GPS is actually really interesting. And there was actually a battle going on between this company called Light Squared and the FCC, because the FCC deals with the frequencies that wireless things can communicate with and everything, and they sell portions of the spectrum.
For sure.
The thing with Light Squared was they wanted to make their own cell phone company, but their communication methods would have possibly messed with GPS, and so the government initially sold it to them, but then they're like, oh wait, this won't work.
We can't use that, so they killed it basically.
They got involved in a whole legal battle and everything like that.
Well, that kind of makes sense though. Yeah.
So look into that. It was pretty interesting. And also I didn't even know this was a thing, but there's a group called the International Telecommunication Union, and there was actually this interesting thing between Galileo versus the Chinese system, BDubs, where I guess the rule is the first country to use a certain frequency can claim that frequency, and
that makes sense.
People can't use it.
Okay.
Yeah. There's a whole...
It's like the moon. The moon belongs to China because we got here first. Real quick. So all these things BDub and the Japanese one and all that stuff, these are all state-sponsored satellites, yes? These aren't corporate...
There are private industries that are involved, but yes, these are owned by the government.
Predominantly state-sponsored. Yeah. How is that going to mesh with Elon's freaking Starlink system that he's putting up, right?
That's a good question.
Because he's completely fucking private and... self-funded.
That's a good question. And that has to do with Spectrum and all that sort of thing.
Spectrum, the internet company.
No.
No, I'm just breaking your balls, dude.
They're really angry. They're pissed off.
I don't like them.
No, that
and Comcast, they can suck it.
So actually, there's this cool picture that I came across that lays out the distances of the satellites from Earth. Okay, so look at that picture. Not only are they transmitting on different frequencies, but they're occupying different distances away from the Earth. So they have different orbits. There are organizations that actually manage all of our satellites and stuff to try to make sure that they don't hit each other. And it's a whole big industry, actually.
Yeah, or degrading orbit, which is crazy. It's that's your job, dude. 24/7, dude. Is keep moving all these 10,000 satellites or however many are up in orbit right now from bunking into each other. It's like a never-ending job.
Yeah, there's so many satellites around the Earth that people are getting worried that eventually we can't even launch rockets from Earth anymore.
Wally.
Yeah.
Yeah. Totally. Damn. So what I'm seeing on here is this image that you just showed me is Galileo and the GPS and the BDubs. GLONASS, I think that's one, right?
GLONASS is Russia.
Russia. Yeah, they're significantly further away than I had initially thought. So for people that can't see it right now, the image that I'm looking at basically has like the Hubble and the International Space Station and stuff.
Which are super close.
Super close to Earth, which obviously you'd want that. And then several, I don't even know what you call that. What is that? Kilometers? Several thousand kilometers outside of that like area, out of the Van Allen radiation belt, which we discussed in the moon landing episode.
The thing about the BDubs being in the headlines recently, it gets a lot of people.
China.
The scaremongers and the conspiracy theorists go crazy.
What do they say, Marcus? I'm not gonna lie. I'm completely. Usually, I got my finger on the pulse of the conspiracy theory.
Yeah, I try not to go too far down this rabbit hole because it's one of those that's very obviously like you don't need to be worried about it. But okay, so first of all, even just within China, as we've talked about, like in the prisons episode, they're very totalitarian and they're not the most freedom-loving.
I mean, yeah.
So tracking your location obviously is not very good. And then there's all this concern about Chinese backdoors and I don't know if you heard about the company Huawei, but they were supposed to they were supposed to contract for the 5G in America, right. And we were. That was a whole thing, and like
now they're being like investigated
Lenovo, where they're just feeding all this data back to the Chinese government.
Right,
is kind of the big one, I guess, that people are scared of. So there's that, and then there's other things like, without getting too far into the tech, GPS isn't really about communicating. It's not, you can't like send messages through it. It's the limitation of the tech.
It's more about like orienting yourself, yeah.
Yeah, but like the different systems in theory could be used to actually. For communications. And not only that, but because it's developed by another country and it's not our system, we don't have
any control over it. Right.
We don't have control over it. We don't know what they're using it for.
And that makes us nervous, obviously.
Yeah. But here's the thing, though. The redundancy between systems, having multiple systems is actually
probably a good thing. Yeah.
It is. Yeah. Because if one system fails, for whatever technical reason, or it gets hacked, or like the satellites crash, or whatever, then we have a backup.
Yeah,
and it makes sense strategically if you're another country, because if America haven't for a long time, but if they were to deny you access to it or do
now presumably there's this other option you can do or whatever, and no, that's good. We want international competition. Mm-hmm. That's not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah.
Now, when you're talking about the job market and, well, I mean, it should be, but like, yeah, you're right. I feel like people would kind of push back on that, but we want to be able to like objectively be able to compare data.
Oh yeah.
You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So be able to, a way of us to be able to see if there's any kind of like nonsense going on is if one side's data is different than the other. And then we're going to have to decide, who's telling the truth and who's lying. And
another funny side note, actually, I guess there's a problem with like the maps in China. They're not super accurate. So it's kind of funny.
No way.
And the other truth is that a lot of people don't realize is most satellite navigation devices actually already use more than one satellite navigation system, more than just GPS.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So like for example, the Snapdragon processor, the Qualcomm Snapdragon, which is in pretty much every Android smartphone.
Okay.
Is able to use GPS, GLONASS, Galileo, BDubs, QZSS, SBAS, GNSS.
So literally like jumps between all the available possibilities?
Right.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah. And then, of course, you supplement that with like Wi-Fi or the cell towers to even make it even more accurate.
Right.
So there's really nothing to be scared of, at least not yet until we discover that they pack something else in those satellites that shoot lasers or something.
Well, it might be one of those things that they might have to kind of get determined by people that know more about the subject than I. But is there a danger between for using the software or the hardware of states that we're not super like politically friendly with? Mm. You know what I mean? Because China definitely has been kind of proven to. Very sneaky, like backdoors and like certain things that they can, like you said, kind of data mine. I'd imagine to be kind of expected for anything that the international community uses to be kind of like objectively what they say it is. I imagine though that in general, that's not like a bad thing. You know what I mean? I mean, imagine we have to kind of keep an eye on it.
Yeah, like I said, the redundancy is good, and other countries have their own, and you're already using multiple services probably anyway. So.
Unbeknownst to you, yeah. The average person doesn't necessarily care. They're just like, I want to know how to get to fucking Pizza Hut.
So you need to use more satellites to triangulate your...
Yep.
Yeah, so...
More information is always better, just as a general rule.
Agreed.
Face to face.